The distant crackle of flames and the acrid scent of smoke jolted Julia Carter from her fitful sleep, her heart instantly hammering against her ribs as she realized the nightmare she'd been having had followed her into the waking world. Throwing aside her quilt, she rushed to the window of her mountain cabin and gasped at the horrifying sight that greeted her. The forest around her isolated homestead was ablaze, orange tongues of fire licking greedily at the drought-stricken pines that surrounded her property on three sides. It was the summer of 1878, and Angel's Camp, California, had seen no rain for nearly 2 months. The mining town nestled in the Sierra Nevada foothills had prospered during the gold rush years, but Julia had chosen to build her life away from the bustle, up on Grizzly Mountain where she could breathe free air and tend to her small herb garden in peace. Now, that decision might cost her everything. "No, no, no," she whispered, hastily pulling on her boots and grabbing her father's old shotgun from above the fireplace. The cabin represented everything she had in the world, built with her own hands after her parents died of fever 3 years earlier, leaving her alone at 22 with nothing but determination and the skills her frontier upbringing had instilled in her. The wind was pushing the fire directly toward her clearing. Julia ran outside, her long chestnut hair whipping around her face as she assessed the danger. The flames were still a quarter-mile away, but moving fast. She needed help, but her nearest neighbor was old Mr. Holloway, 5 miles down the mountain path, too far to reach in time. Just as panic threatened to overwhelm her, the sound of hoofbeats pounded up the trail. A rider emerged from the smoke-hazed tree line, his horse lathered with sweat and nostrils flaring. The man pulled his mount to a sharp halt in her yard, his tall frame silhouetted against the fiery backdrop. "Madam," he called out in a deep voice touched with a southern drawl, "that fire's headed straight for you. We need to get you out of here now." Julia stepped forward, shotgun still in hand. "I'm not leaving my home." The stranger dismounted in one fluid motion, and in the glow of the approaching inferno, she could see he was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing the practical attire of a cowhand, leather chaps over denim trousers, a cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled up revealing tanned forearms, and a worn Stetson pulled low over his eyes. "Name's Knox Lawrence," he said, removing his hat briefly to reveal dark hair and eyes that reflected the distant flames. "I'm foreman at the Broken Spur Ranch down in the valley. Spotted the fire while checking the high pastures and saw your cabin." His gaze traveled over the small structure. "You can't stay here. That fire will take everything." Julia's chin lifted stubbornly. "This is all I have in the world, Mr. Lawrence. I won't abandon it." Something in her tone must have resonated with him because his expression shifted from urgency to consideration. He glanced around the clearing, eyes narrowing as he assessed the situation with a seasoned rancher's practicality. "You got a well, water source nearby?" he asked abruptly. "Yes, out back, and a stream about 50 yards to the east," Knox nodded curtly. "Then maybe we've got a chance." He strode back to his horse and pulled a shovel and axe from his saddlebags. "If you're staying to fight, I'll help you. But if this gets too dangerous, you follow my lead and we ride out." "Deal." Julia studied him for a moment. There was nothing soft about Knox Lawrence. His face was weathered from years under the sun, his hands calloused from hard work, and his eyes held the direct, unflinching gaze of a man accustomed to making life or death decisions. But there was something else there too, a steadiness that inspired trust. "Deal," she agreed, then extended her hand. "Julia Carter." His large hand enveloped hers in a brief, firm grip. "Let's get to work, Miss Carter." For the next hour, they labored side by side, Julia following Knox's experienced direction. They dug a fire break around the cabin, clearing away brush and anything else that might feed the flames. Knox took his horse to the stream, rigging up saddlebags to carry water back to soak the ground immediately surrounding the cabin. As they worked, Julia learned that Knox had fought wildfires before during a particularly dry season in Texas. He'd come to California 5 years ago seeking work and eventually earned his position as foreman at the Broken Spur. "Why build all the way up here alone?" he asked as they filled buckets from the well. Julia wiped sweat from her brow, leaving a smudge of dirt. "My parents died." The town was full of memories, up here. She gestured to the vista of rolling hills and valleys that was now obscured by smoke. "I can breathe, or I could." Knox nodded, understanding written on his features. "Independence matters. More than anything," she affirmed. The fire was drawing closer now, the heat intensifying. Embers sailed through the air, landing on the dampened earth around the cabin with ominous hisses. Knox's horse was growing increasingly agitated, and he led the animal to a small fenced area behind the cabin where Julia's own mare was nervously pacing. "If we lose this fight, we'll need both horses to get down the mountain fast," Knox said, checking that the gate was secure. Julia nodded grimly, then suddenly lunged forward as a flaming branch crashed down near the edge of her vegetable garden. She stomped out the sparks determinedly, the dry earth puffing dust around her boots. "You grow your own food?" Knox asked, helping her douse the area with more water. "Everything I need. Vegetables, herbs for medicine. I sell the surplus in town once a month. It's enough to buy what I can't make or grow." A look of admiration crossed his face. "You're not like most women I've met, Miss Carter." A small smile tugged at her lips despite the dire situation. "I'll take that as a compliment, Mr. Lawrence." The wind suddenly shifted, bringing a gust of hot air and smoke that enveloped them. Julia coughed violently, her eyes stinging. Without hesitation, Knox pulled a bandana from his pocket and dampened it with water from his canteen. "Here," he said, gently tying it around her face. "Breathe through this." Their eyes met for a brief moment, and Julia felt an unexpected flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with the smoke. She quickly looked away, focusing on the task at hand. The next few hours passed in a blur of heat, smoke, and exhausting labor. The fire reached the edge of the cleared area, and they fought it back with wet blankets and buckets of water, their bodies drenched with sweat, lungs burning from the smoke. Knox worked tirelessly, his powerful frame moving with purpose and determination as he battled the flames that threatened to leap across their makeshift barrier. Julia matched his efforts with her own fierce determination, refusing to yield to fatigue or fear. Once, when a sudden flare-up threatened the corner of her cabin, she rushed toward it without hesitation. Knox pulled her back just as a burning tree crashed down where she would have been standing. "Careful," he growled, his hand lingering on her arm. "That cabin won't mean much if you're not around to live in it." The night deepened, and the fire seemed to gain strength with the darkness, illuminating the forest in an apocalyptic glow. The roar of the flames was deafening, punctuated by the crash of falling trees. Julia had never felt so small against the raw power of nature, yet she drew strength from the unwavering presence of the man fighting alongside her. Near midnight, a terrifying wall of fire surged toward them, pushed by a sudden gust of wind. The heat was unbearable, scorching their skin even from a distance. "Get behind the cabin," Knox shouted, grabbing her hand and pulling her toward the relative safety of the structure's shadow. They huddled together, watching as flames licked at the edge of the clearing. Julia's heart sank. They had fought so hard, but the fire seemed determined to claim her home. "I'm sorry," she whispered, more to herself than to Knox. "I should have left when you first arrived. Knox's gaze was fixed on the approaching fire. "Not yet," he said firmly. "We're not done fighting." Just then, a miraculous change occurred. The wind shifted again, this time blowing back toward the already burned areas of the forest. The flames closest to them wavered, then slowly began to retreat. "Look," Julia gasped, pointing to the sky. Dark clouds had gathered overhead, obscuring the stars. The first drops of rain fell like a benediction, sizzling as they hit the hot ground. More followed, gradually increasing to a steady downpour that hissed and steamed as it met the fire's edge. Knox and Julia stood in the rain, faces turned upward, too exhausted to speak but sharing a moment of pure, profound relief. By dawn, the immediate danger had passed. The rain continued to fall, dousing the remaining hot spots. Julia's cabin stood intact, though the surrounding forest was a blackened ruin. The air was thick with the smell of wet ash and charred wood. Julia sat on her porch steps, a blanket around her shoulders, watching as Knox checked the perimeter one last time. His clothes were filthy, his face streaked with soot, but he moved with the same steady purpose he'd shown all night. When he returned to the cabin, she handed him a cup of hot coffee. "You saved my home," she said simply. Knox accepted the cup, his fingers brushing hers. "We saved it together." They sat in companionable silence as the gray light of morning gradually brightened. Julia studied him covertly, noticing the lines of fatigue around his eyes, the small burn on his forearm he hadn't mentioned, the quiet dignity with which he carried himself. "You should get some rest before you head back to your ranch," she suggested. "I have a spare room." Knox hesitated, then nodded. "Much obliged. I should check on the horses first." As he rose to tend to the animals, Julia remained on the steps, contemplating the strange twist of fate that had brought this man to her mountain just when she needed him most. She didn't know then that the wildfire that had threatened to destroy her world had actually set in motion events that would change it forever. While Knox slept in her spare room, Julia tended to the garden, salvaging what she could. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a fresh, clean scent that mingled with the acrid reminder of how close she had come to losing everything. Later that afternoon, Knox emerged from the cabin, his face freshly washed and his hair still damp. He had a presence that seemed to fill the small clearing, making Julia acutely aware of him in a way she hadn't been during the urgent fight against the fire. "I should head back," he said, though he made no move toward his horse. "They'll be wondering what happened to me at the ranch." Julia nodded, surprised by the pang of disappointment she felt. "Of course. I've packed some food for your journey." She handed him a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Their fingers touched, lingering longer than necessary. Knox's dark eyes held hers, and something unspoken passed between them. "Miss Carter," he began, then paused, seeming to search for words. "Julia," she corrected softly. A smile touched his lips. "Julia, I'd like to check on you in a few days, make sure everything's still secure here." "I'd like that," she replied, a warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the summer heat. As promised, Knox returned 3 days later, bringing with him tools and supplies to help repair the minor damage the cabin had sustained. He didn't mention that he'd ridden nearly 2 hours each way, or that he'd purchased some of the supplies with his own wages. Julia welcomed him with freshly baked bread, and a smile that lit up her face in a way that caught Knox off guard. They worked together through the afternoon, replacing damaged roof shingles and reinforcing the porch where embers had burned small holes. "You're handy with tools for a cowboy," Julia observed as Knox skillfully replaced a section of scorched siding. He chuckled, a low, pleasant sound that sent an unexpected thrill through her. "My pa was a carpenter before he took to ranching, taught me everything he knew. Your parents, are they?" Gone, Knox replied, his expression softening with old grief. Pa 5 years back, Ma the year after. That's when I left Texas. Nothing holding me there anymore, Julia nodded, understanding all too well the hollow space left by such loss. Is that why you came to my aid? Because you know what it's like to lose everything? Knox paused in his work, considering her question. Maybe partly. But mostly. He met her gaze directly. I couldn't ride by knowing someone might need help, especially not. He stopped, seemingly embarrassed by what he'd been about to say. Especially not what? Julia pressed, her heart beating faster. Especially not a woman alone, he finished. But something in his eyes told her there was more to it than that. As the days passed and summer progressed, Knox continued to visit the mountain cabin. Sometimes, he brought supplies seeds for Julia's garden to replace what had been lost in the fire, or game he'd hunted on his way up the trail. Other times he came with nothing but his presence, helping with repairs or simply sitting on the porch with her as the evening cooled, talking of their lives, their dreams, their memories. Julia found herself looking forward to these visits with an eagerness that both excited and frightened her. She had built her life around independence, around not needing anyone. Yet now she caught herself watching the trail for his approach, or preparing special meals she thought he might enjoy. Knox, too, seemed drawn to the mountain and its solitary inhabitant. The hands at the broken spur began to notice their foreman's regular absences, exchanging knowing glances when he would ride out after his duties were complete, always in the direction of Grizzly Mountain. One evening in late August, they sat on Julia's porch watching fireflies dance in the twilight. The forest was beginning to recover from the fire, new green growth emerging from the blackened earth. Nature always finds a way to rebuild, Julia observed, her voice soft in the gathering darkness. Knox nodded, his shoulder nearly touching hers as they sat side by side. People too, if they're strong enough. Their hands rested on the wooden step between them, not quite touching. Julia was acutely aware of the small distance, of how easy it would be to bridge that gap. "Why did you really come back that first time?" she asked suddenly, turning to face him. "After the fire was out and my cabin was safe." Knox was silent for a long moment, his profile strong against the fading light. Finally, he turned to her, his expression open and unguarded in a way she hadn't seen before. "Because I couldn't stop thinking about the woman who stood her ground against a wildfire," he said simply. "Who built a life with her own 2 hands and wouldn't abandon it even when the world was burning down around her." The honesty in his voice made something tighten in Julia's chest. Without thinking, she reached across the small space between them and placed her hand over his. His skin was warm and rough with calluses, a working man's hand. He turned his palm up, interlacing their fingers with deliberate care. "I've never met anyone like you, Julia Carter," he said, his voice lower, more intimate. The moment hung between them, fragile and charged with possibility. Then, with exquisite slowness, Knox leaned toward her. Julia met him halfway, their lips coming together in a kiss that was both gentle and revelatory. When they parted, Julia's heart was racing, her breath coming quick and shallow. Knox's eyes held hers, a question in their depths. "I didn't come up this mountain looking for this," he murmured, his free hand coming up to trace the line of her jaw. Julia leaned into his touch. "Neither did I. I came here to be alone." A smile tugged at his lips. "And here I am, disturbing your solitude." "Some disturbances are worth welcoming," she replied, and drew him back to her for another kiss. As summer gave way to autumn, Knox and Julia's connection deepened. He began staying overnight more frequently, initially in the spare room but eventually sharing her bed. their bodies finding a harmony as natural as their companionship. Julia, who had never thought to share her mountain sanctuary with anyone, found herself opening not just her home but her heart to this steady, honorable man who had fought beside her against the flames. Knox, for his part, found himself increasingly torn between his duties at the Broken Spur and his desire to be with Julia. The ranch owner, John Buchanan, had noticed his foreman's divided attention and called him into the ranch house one crisp October morning. "You're the best foreman I've had, Lawrence," Buchanan said, pouring whiskey into 2 glasses despite the early hour. "But a man can't serve 2 masters, or in your case, a master and a mountain woman." Knox accepted the drink but didn't sip it. "Mr. Buchanan, I've never shirked my responsibilities here." "Not yet," the older man agreed, settling into his leather chair. "But I've seen that look before. You're halfway gone already." He studied Knox over the rim of his glass. "Tell me about her." Surprised by the question, Knox considered how to describe Julia to someone who had never met her. "She's unlike anyone I've ever known," he said finally. "Strong, independent, built her own cabin up on Grizzly Mountain after her parents died, grows her own food, makes her own medicines. Would have fought that wildfire alone if I hadn't happened by." Buchanan's bushy eyebrows rose. "Sounds like quite a woman." "She is," Knox agreed, a note of pride in his voice. The ranch owner nodded thoughtfully. "My wife was like that, tough as rawhide but gentle when it mattered. 30 years we had together before the consumption took her." A shadow of old grief crossed his weathered face. "Don't waste time, son. That's the only advice I'll give you." Knox returned to the mountain that evening with much on his mind. He found Julia in her garden, harvesting the last of the season's vegetables before the first frost. The setting sun turned her chestnut hair to fire, reminding him of the night they'd met. She looked up as he approached, her smile warming him more than any hearth ever could. "You're early today," she said, rising to greet him. Knox took her hands in his, soil-stained as they were. "Julia, I need to ask you something." Her expression grew serious, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "What is it?" He took a deep breath. "I've been offered a piece of land." Buchanan's selling off a section of the Broken Spur, 100 acres with good water and pasture. Says he's getting too old to manage the whole spread. Julia's brow furrowed. "That's wonderful, Knox. You'd make a fine rancher on your own." "The thing is," he continued, his heart pounding harder than it had even when facing the wildfire, "it's not what I want if you're not part of it." Her eyes widened as understanding dawned. "Knox, I love you, Julia Carter," he said simply. "I love your strength and your spirit. I love the life you've built here, but I want to build something with you if you'll have me." Julia's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment Knox feared he'd misread everything between them. Then she smiled, a radiant expression that chased away all doubt. "I never thought I'd want to share my mountain with anyone," she said softly. "But then you fought a fire for me and somehow fought your way into my heart too." She squeezed his hands. "Yes, Knox Lawrence, I'll build a life with you." Their kiss was a promise, sealed in the golden light of sunset with the mountain bearing silent witness. The following spring found Julia and Knox standing before a preacher in Angel's Camp, exchanging vows surrounded by a small gathering of friends, mostly hands from the Broken Spur, and a few townsfolk who had come to know Julia through her herb sales. She wore a simple dress of pale blue, with wildflowers in her hair instead of a veil. Knox stood tall in a new shirt and vest, his usually tanned face slightly pale with emotion as he promised to love and cherish her all the days of his life. They built their new life with the same determination with which they had fought the wildfire. Knox's land became the beginning of the Firebreak Ranch, named in remembrance of how they had met. Julia's cabin on the mountain remained, a retreat they would visit when the valley heat grew too intense, or when Julia needed to gather certain herbs that only grew at higher elevations. Their home in the valley was larger, but retained much of the character of Julia's mountain-dwelling sturdy logs, a wide porch for sitting in the evenings, and a generous herb garden that soon became known throughout the county for its medicinal plants. Julia continued to make her remedies, her reputation spreading so that people would travel considerable distances to consult with her about ailments conventional medicine couldn't cure. Knox proved to be as skilled at ranching his own land as he had been managing Buchanan's. He had a natural affinity for horses and began breeding stock that combined the stamina of Western ponies with the speed of Eastern thoroughbreds. Within 3 years, the Firebreak Ranch was becoming known for its quality horseflesh as well as Julia's medicines. Their happiness was made complete in the winter of 1882, when Julia gave birth to a son they named Daniel, after her father. Knox held the infant with a tenderness that brought tears to Julia's eyes, his calloused fingers gentle against the baby's soft skin. "He has your eyes," Julia whispered, watching as their son's tiny hand wrapped around Knox's thumb. "And your spirit, I'll wager," Knox replied, carefully returning the baby to her arms. "God help us when he starts walking." Julia laughed, the sound rich with contentment. "Between the two of us, I think we can manage one small boy." Life was not without its challenges. The following year brought drought again, though not as severe as the one that had spawned the wildfire. Their cattle suffered, and they lost a promising colt to colic, despite Julia's best efforts to save it. Knox worked himself to exhaustion ensuring their stock had enough water, digging a new well when the old one began to run dry. Through it all, they faced each obstacle together, their partnership stronger for having been forged in fire. They complemented each other, Knox's practicality, balancing Julia's occasional impetuousness, her intuitive understanding of plants and healing arts expanding his more straightforward approach to ranching. On the 5th anniversary of the wildfire, they rode up to Julia's cabin on the mountain. The forest had recovered remarkably. New pines stood tall among the blackened trunks of their predecessors, and underbrush grew thick where once there had been only ash. They had maintained the cabin well, using it occasionally when they needed to get away from the demands of the ranch. Little Daniel, now 3 years old and already showing his father's affinity for horses, rode before Knox on the saddle, his eyes wide with excitement at the adventure. "Mama's house," he exclaimed as the cabin came into view, pointing with a chubby finger. Julia smiled, adjusting her position in the saddle to accommodate her growing belly. Their second child was due in the autumn, and Knox had been reluctant to let her make the journey up the mountain trail. But Julia had insisted, feeling a need to mark this anniversary in the place where their story had begun. They spent the night in the cabin, Daniel sleeping soundly in the small trundle bed Knox had built for him. After the boy was asleep, Knox and Julia sat on the porch steps just as they had that evening years ago when they had first acknowledged the feelings growing between them. "You ever regret it?" Knox asked suddenly, his arm around her shoulders. "Giving up your independence to marry a cowboy?" Julia turned to him, surprised by the question. "I never gave up my independence," she said firmly. "I chose to share my life with you. There's a world of difference between the two." Knox smiled, the lines around his eyes crinkling. At 36, he was still as handsome as the day he'd ridden out of the smoke to save her home, though now with threads of silver beginning to appear at his temples. "You're right, as usual," he conceded, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Besides," Julia continued, placing his hand on her rounded belly where their child kicked vigorously, I think we've created something far better than either of us could have built alone." They remained on the porch late into the night, reminiscing about the fire that had nearly claimed everything but had ultimately given Julia something she hadn't known. She was missing a partner, a family, a love that burned as steady and true as the stars overhead. As the years passed, the Firebreak Ranch prospered. Knox and Julia's family grew to include 4 children: Daniel, followed by his sisters Sarah and Emma, and finally another son, Thomas. The mountain cabin became a special place for family retreats, each child learning to love the solitude and beauty of the high country just as their mother had. Knox expanded their horse breeding operation, developing a line known for both beauty and endurance. Julia's herb business flourished alongside it, her remedies gaining such renown that a pharmaceutical company in San Francisco once offered to buy her formulas. She declined, preferring to keep her knowledge within the family and the community she served. Their children grew up strong and capable, each finding their own path while remaining connected to the land and values their parents had instilled in them. Daniel took naturally to ranching, working alongside his father from an early age and eventually taking over more responsibility as Knox grew older. Sarah inherited her mother's knowledge of herbs and healing, apprenticing with Julia and expanding her skills with formal medical training in Sacramento. Emma discovered a talent for training the horses they bred, her gentle but firm touch earning the trust of even the most difficult animals. Thomas, the youngest, combined his father's business acumen with his mother's love of growing things, developing new methods of sustainable farming that helped the ranch through the changing times. Through it all, Knox and Julia remained the heart of the Firebreak Ranch, their partnership a testament to what could be built from the ashes of loss and the courage to begin again. In 1903, 25 years after the wildfire, they held a celebration at the ranch. Friends, family, and neighbors gathered to commemorate not just the anniversary of Knox and Julia's meeting, but the community they had helped build. The original 100 acres had grown to over 500, and the Firebreak name was known throughout California for its horses, herbal remedies, and hospitality. At 50, Julia remained as spirited as ever, though her chestnut hair was now streaked with silver, and the lines around her eyes spoke of years of laughter and occasional sorrow. Knox, approaching 60, had slowed somewhat but still rode daily, his tall frame as straight in the saddle as it had been when he'd first come charging up the mountain trail to warn a stubborn woman about an approaching fire. After the festivities, when their guests had departed, and their children had returned to their own homes on various parts of the property, Knox and Julia sat on the porch of the main house, much as they used to sit on the steps of the mountain cabin. 25 years, Knox mused, his voice still deep but with a slight roughness that came with age. Sometimes it feels like yesterday I rode up that mountain and found you standing there with your shotgun, refusing to leave. Julia smiled, leaning against his shoulder. And sometimes it feels like I've known you all my life. In all the ways that matter you have, he replied, taking her hand in his. The hands of both were worn now, marked by years of work and weather, but they fit together as perfectly as ever. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sunset paint the valley in hues of gold and crimson, reminiscent of the flames that had brought them together. "We should ride up to the cabin tomorrow," Julia suggested. "Just the two of us. Daniel and Sarah can handle things here for a day or two." Knox nodded, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Like a second honeymoon, exactly," she agreed, her eyes twinkling with the same spirit that had captivated him all those years ago. "Though this time without a wildfire chasing us. I don't know, Knox teased, pulling her closer. That fire brought me the best thing that ever happened to me. Maybe we should light a small one for luck. Julia laughed and swatted his arm playfully. Knox Lawrence, don't you dare even joke about such a thing. He captured her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm, his expression growing more serious. No need for fire anyway. What's between us has never stopped burning. The next day, they rode up the familiar trail to the mountain cabin. The journey took longer than it once had, their pace more measured to accommodate bodies that had worked hard for many years. But there was a sweetness to the slower rhythm, allowing them to notice details they might have missed in their younger, more hurried days, the way sunlight dappled through the leaves, the call of a hawk circling overhead, the scent of pine and earth that had been the backdrop to their life together. The cabin stood as it always had, sturdy and welcoming against the backdrop of the mountain. Knox had maintained it faithfully over the years, replacing shingles and floorboards as needed, adding a larger stone fireplace when the original began to crumble. Yet its essence remained unchanged, a sanctuary, a beginning point, a physical embodiment of Julia's independent spirit and Knox's steadfast devotion. They spent 2 days in the peaceful solitude of the mountain, reminiscing about the past and making plans for the future. Though they were no longer young, there was still so much they wanted to do: see their grandchildren grow, pass on their knowledge of the land, perhaps even travel a bit now that their children could manage the ranch. On their final evening, as dusk painted the sky in soft purples and blues, Knox built a small fire in the clearing, not a dangerous wildfire, but a contained, comforting blaze that reminded them of their beginning without threatening what they had built. "Remember that first night?" Julia asked, her hand in his as they sat before the flames. "When you appeared out of nowhere like some avenging angel," Knox chuckled. "I remember a stubborn woman who wouldn't leave her home even with hell bearing down on her. And I remember a cowboy who could have ridden on, but chose to stay and fight alongside a stranger." "Best decision I ever made," Knox said simply, bringing her hand to his lips. Julia leaned her head against his shoulder, content in a way she never could have imagined before that fateful night. She had built her cabin on this mountain seeking independence, never knowing that true freedom would come not from standing alone, but from finding someone who would stand beside her through whatever fires life might bring. "I love you, Knox Lawrence," she said softly, the words as true now as they had been when first spoken a quarter century ago. "And I love you, Julia Lawrence," he replied, his voice warm with the certainty of a love tested by time and found enduring. "From that first night until my last breath." The fire crackled before them, flames dancing in a gentle echo of the wildfire that had once threatened everything, but had instead given them everything that mattered. As darkness fell completely, the stars emerged overhead, witnesses to a love story written not just in the dramatic rescue of a single night, but in the thousands of ordinary days that followed, days of work and rest, joy and sorrow, always faced together. In the years that followed, Knox and Julia continued to be the foundation upon which the extended Lawrence family built their legacy. As they grew older, they gradually handed more responsibility to their children, but never lost their connection to the land or to each other. When Knox's eyesight began to fail in his late 60s, Julia became his eyes, describing sunsets and new foals and the faces of their growing brood of grandchildren. When Julia's hands grew too stiff with arthritis to prepare her herbal medicines, Knox's fingers, though less nimble than in his youth, helped separate leaves from stems and grind roots to powder. They adapted as they always had, finding new ways to support each other through the changes age brought. Their children marveled at the partnership that seemed to strengthen rather than diminish with the passing years. "How do you do it?" Sarah asked her mother once, after witnessing a silent exchange between her parents that resulted in Knox anticipating and meeting Julia's need before she had even expressed it. Julia smiled, watching as Knox demonstrated to young Jamie, their oldest grandchild, how to properly saddle a horse despite not being able to see the buckles clearly anymore. When you fight a wildfire with someone, you learn to read them, to trust them. Everything after that is just practice. In the spring of 1918, as the world was emerging from the Great War and a devastating influenza pandemic, Knox and Julia celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary. Now in their 80s, they had slowed considerably but remained vital presences in their family and community. The celebration was held at the main ranch house, which had been expanded over the decades but still retained elements of the original structure Knox had built for his bride. 4 generations of the Lawrence family gathered to honor the couple whose love had created this thriving dynasty. Daniel, now the patriarch of the ranching operation, had his father's height and steady manner. Sarah had established a small hospital in Angel's Camp, incorporating her mother's herbal knowledge with modern medical practices. Emma's horse training methods had become standard throughout California, and Thomas's agricultural innovations had helped the Firebreak Ranch weather economic downturns that had destroyed other operations. Grandchildren and even a few great-grandchildren filled the house with laughter and energy, a living testament to what Knox and Julia had begun. After the festivities, when most of the family had departed, Knox asked for his horse to be saddled. "Father, are you sure?" Daniel asked, concerned. It had been several months since Knox had ridden, his balance not being what it once was. "I'm sure," Knox replied with quiet determination. "Your mother and I are going up to the cabin." Julia, overhearing this exchange, stepped forward. "Knox, it's a long ride. Perhaps we should wait for a cooler day." Knox took her hand, his clouded eyes finding hers with the precision of long familiarity. "It's our anniversary, Julia. 40 years. We should be where we began." Something in his tone made Julia study him more closely. What she saw in his face, a mixture of love, certainty, and peaceful acceptance, brought tears to her eyes. She nodded, understanding passing between them as it had countless times over their decades together. "Yes," she agreed softly. "We should be at the cabin." Daniel, sensing something profound in this exchange that he wasn't meant to fully comprehend, arranged for them to be taken up the mountain in a wagon rather than on horseback. Knox initially protested, but relented when Julia pointed out that this way they could bring more supplies and stay longer. The journey took most of the day, the wagon moving slowly up the trail that had been widened over the years to allow for easier access. Julia sat close to Knox, pointing out landmarks along the way, describing the changing landscape as spring painted the mountainside in fresh colors. Knox listened, occasionally adding his own memories of riding this trail in all seasons, in all kinds of weather, always drawn to the woman who had made her home on the mountain. The cabin welcomed them as it always had. Though they visited less frequently now, their children and grandchildren maintained it well, recognizing its importance in the family story. A fire was already laid in the hearth, and fresh supplies stocked in the small pantry. For 3 days, Knox and Julia lived simply in the place where their story had begun. They walked short distances in the surrounding forest, Knox leaning on a walking stick and Julia's arm. They sat on the porch and listened to birds singing in trees that had grown tall in the 40 years since the wildfire. They spoke of their life together, not just the momentous occasions, but the quiet, ordinary moments that had been the true measure of their bond. On the third night, as they lay in the bed that had replaced the narrow cot Julia had slept in when Knox first arrived, he drew her close against the chill mountain air. "Julia," he said, his voice low in the darkness, "are you happy with the life we built?" She raised herself on one elbow to look at him, though he could see only her silhouette now. "Knox Lawrence, what kind of question is that after 40 years?" He smiled, reaching up to touch her face, his fingers tracing features he knew better than his own. "Humor an old man." Julia caught his hand and pressed a kiss to his palm. "Yes," she said simply. "I'm happier than I ever thought possible. From the moment I saw you standing in that yard, refusing to abandon your home even with a wildfire bearing down on you, I knew my life would never be the same." He paused, his breath catching slightly. "You were the bravest, most beautiful thing I'd ever seen, still are." They fell silent, holding each other as the night deepened around them. Eventually, Julia felt Knox's breathing slow and deepen as he drifted to sleep, his arms still around her as they had been on countless nights throughout their marriage. When she woke in the early dawn light, she knew immediately that something had changed. Knox lay beside her, his face peaceful, but the rise and fall of his chest had stilled. Sometime in the night, his heart had quietly stopped, having completed its long and faithful service. Julia did not cry out or call for help that no one could provide. Instead, she lay beside him, her head on his shoulder, and whispered her goodbye. She thanked him for the life they had shared, for the family they had created, for the love that had sustained them through 40 years of joy and hardship. "You saved more than my cabin that night," she told him softly. "You saved me from a life half lived. Wait for me, my love, it won't be long." She was right. 3 months later, surrounded by her children and grandchildren in the main house of the Firebreak Ranch, Julia Carter Lawrence followed her husband into whatever adventure awaited beyond this life. She went peacefully, a smile on her face as if she could already see Knox waiting for her, tall and strong as he had been when he rode through smoke and flame to find her. They were buried together on a hillside overlooking the ranch, a place where the mountain cabin was visible in the distance. A simple headstone marked their resting place, bearing their names, dates, and the words forged in fire, enduring in love. The story of Knox and Julia Lawrence became legend in California's gold country, how a wildfire had threatened a woman's mountain home, how a cowboy had fought the flames all night and saved it, and how that night of courage and determination had kindled a love that burned steady and true for 40 years. But the true legacy of Knox and Julia lived on in more tangible ways in the Firebreak Ranch that continued to thrive under the stewardship of their descendants. In Sarah's hospital that combined traditional and modern healing methods. In Emma's horse training academy that taught her gentle but effective techniques. In Thomas's agricultural innovations that helped farmers throughout the region. Most of all, their legacy lived in the example they set for their family and community, that love is not just passion and grand gestures, but daily choices to stand together through whatever fires life may bring. That true partnership means fighting for each other's dreams as fiercely as your own. That sometimes the greatest adventures begin when you think all might be lost. And up on Grizzly Mountain, the cabin still stands maintained now as a family retreat where new generations of Lawrences come to connect with their history. On summer evenings, when the light fades and the stars emerge, it's said that if you sit very quietly on the porch steps, you might just catch the echo of laughter, the murmur of voices, a woman with a spirit as wild as the mountain itself, and the cowboy who loved her enough to fight a wildfire to save her home and, in doing so, found his own.